Today we are going to be talking about the AI Trust Summit. Um, Thank you so much for being here. So last week we had the summit, which was pretty much a full day of sessions. We had practitioners from a whole bunch of companies across financial services, oil and gas, insurance, security, and way more people. So I'm joined by Kyle Kirwan, who is our Chief Strategy Officer here at Bigeye, and Egor Gryaznov, who is our field CTO. We're basically going to walk through the use cases, the problems that kept showing up with these enterprise rollouts of AI projects, and the advice that our speakers gave. If you actually missed the AI Trust Summit, it is on our website, so you can view all of the sessions over there. But basically, we are going to kick off with a question for both of you, which is what is still with you from the day? And I will give that to Kyle.
I think, well, first off, big thanks to all the speakers for some great talks. I think the thing was the consistency in some of the points that they had. I think pretty much everybody that was there that was giving a talk has been a practitioner, and has helped put things in production at their respective companies, or has at least been leading the team that's doing that work. And they all come from different industries, and so there's different use cases, but a lot of the points I think that they've learned over the last year of putting things into production were similar, which is cool, because it shows that that you see a lot of the same challenges and some of the same solutions work, even if you're in a totally different vertical. So that was cool.
For sure. Igor, how about you? Was there anything that surprised you about the sessions, about our speakers?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on what Kyle said, that consistency, there is definitely a theme that I heard throughout all the presentations, which was using governance as an accelerator rather than a blocker to adoption. It came up in practically every session where knowing and understanding what AI is doing, how it's being used, what data it's consuming is critical for the success of the effort. And it shouldn't be viewed as something that is going to hinder progress or slow you down, but something that, if implemented early enough and correctly, can then accelerate adoption throughout your organization. From a surprising perspective, as a very hands-on customer facing practitioner, what I really enjoyed is how practical all the sessions were. Not a lot of slides, a lot of real conversations about real stories and implementations. I effectively got what I would normally get in a month's worth of in one-on-one conversations in a day. So that was really pleasantly surprising.
Awesome. Yeah, so I would love to kind of start with talking about what is actually in production at some of these companies. So there were five use cases from a few companies across totally different industries. So I'm going to start by walking through each one, kind of what they built, why they built, and what happened, and then we'll kind of talk about what they have in common. So the first one, Igor, you actually led the session with Miles from Fringe Benefit Group. So Miles is the VP and head of data at Fringe Benefit Group, which is an insurance benefits company. He came in about a year ago with a very clear vision on what he wanted. They used to do everything on paper, and he was really focused on modernizing and simplifying governing their data. And he kind of made a decision that I don't think a lot of companies have the option to make, which is that he skipped building a traditional BI layer pretty much entirely and went straight to conversational analytics. He also built a finance and health operations agent for his executives who had pretty much never logged into Snowflake before. And he actually had a great quote where he said, "People don't want reports, they want answers. If the only option you gave them was a report, that's what people are going to ask for." So obviously, skipping BI entirely is not really a path that most companies take. So what did Fringe Benefit Group have in place that kind of made that leap possible from paper to AI, which is a pretty dramatic change?
It's definitely a dramatic change. It's even more dramatic than what a lot of companies are going through right now, which is moving from Excel into BI. And but I think that what Miles pointed out in the session that he did really well with the organization is being first of all, staying with platforms that are well understood, not introducing new tooling, but also proactively thinking about how to adapt his processes and his company's processes to fit those platforms. He talked a lot about governance first. Which use cases are we solving for who? How do we express those? How do we ensure adoption within the organization? And all these questions that he answered, got answers to, made it possible for him to sort of say, great, I know what problem I'm solving. I can now pick the right solution for that. And in his case, that was going straight to conversational analytics. I think the to your quote was spot on, which is people want answers. And AI has enabled us to provide pointed answers to specific questions rather than having to go to a dashboard and interpret numbers or charts that you're seeing on screen. You can now ask a business question and get a response. Now, obviously, the tricky part there is trusting that response and knowing that it's correct, which was obviously what the whole summit
Whole
was
point of
about,
the
the whole point of
summit.
it. But that is, I think that's a massive leap in terms of being able to get insights from your data nowadays. And that also ties into, bring executives into it. Executives don't have time to look at, 20 different reports to make some kind of conclusion. They want an answer to a question that can then inform the strategies that they're taking and implementing at the organization. And so going straight to conversational analytics allows Fringe Benefit Group to then say we can provide value at every altitude of our organization, all the way from executives to the people automating their day-to-day processes through this technology, as long as we have the right foundation for it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for walking us through that. The next use case that I want to talk about is actually at Salesforce. So Stephen Booth was one of our speakers, and he runs the team at Salesforce that builds security agents for detection and response. So he has about 220 people in his team. And he shared a number that I think is really interesting, which that is more than half of all of the work that comes into his team now just kind of disappears. It's handled completely autonomously. And that happened mostly in the past year. And he also described building one agent to monitor his other agents for drift, for issues, basically when an agent starts giving different answers than it was before. And he actually was able to launch that in 2 to 3 days, which I think is pretty crazy. But Kyle, I would love for you to dive into this. So, when he built that agent to monitor the other agents, is this like something that, enterprises are going to move towards? Is that kind of the right mental model? Agents checking other agents? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's really cool that he did that. So the sort of traditional way for, or well, traditional is probably not a great word for it, but like the pattern that has emerged for monitoring agent performance with evals, you've got things like static evals. So that would be checking that in a particular scenario, how frequently does the agent achieve a very specific like target end state. So those are things that are, you can think of them kind of like fixed unit tests that are static. Um, Another way of evaluating the output would be a human scoring. So you see what did the agent do? You actually like review and a human says like, yes, this was a good result or not. But that's obviously expensive, time consuming. What Stephen did is the third option, which is usually referred to as model as judge. So you have one model, doing the work, and then you have another one that's evaluating the output. And it turns out that that's actually a really great application, and having a completely separate instance of a model reviewing the work from another model is actually, it works fairly well in practice. And obviously, it's been working for Stephen. It's interesting and I think cool that he has done that by building an agent to basically like watch and evaluate the other agents, as opposed to, there's some platforms out there for doing this kind of thing, like Brain Trust and Arise both come to mind for me. But it's cool that he just kind of solved it himself in a couple of days. I assume by using, a coding agent to help him build another agent to do the evals on the other agent. But no, I mean, like practically, that does seem to be a very viable path. And I'm sure that he's going to be able to actually get, alerts or some performance metrics out of that about potential drift or issues in the responses from the agents. Um, I maybe the first time I had encountered this concept like a couple years ago of like, hey, why don't we check the output from one LLM using another LLM? I was like a little bit sort of vaguely uncomfortable with that conceptually. So maybe other people feel that way as well on first contact. But like at this point, like there's a pretty good track record behind using this type of approach, and obviously it's been working for Stephen too.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So now I'm going to go through two use cases, and actually, I'll come back to you, Kyle, because I have kind of a similar question. So Adam Nielsen from NOV, they make technology and equipment for the oil and gas industry. Adam's team is basically tackling two very different problems. So the first one was supply chain. So they're using AI for demand forecasting, inventory optimization, shipping logistics, and then on the operational side, they're also using AI to detect like issues with their pumps, compressors, turbines, basically looking for failures before they actually happen. So that way maintenance can kind of manage things in advance before it turns into an outage. And he actually shared some really interesting benchmarks, which is that Shell actually was able to reduce their downtime by 20%. And obviously, when we're thinking about these companies that, are dealing with billions of dollars in infrastructure and equipment and everything, 20% is, an insane number. And then in fraud detection, so at Navy Federal, we had Barack Aden, which is the manager of data risk governance at Navy Federal, which is, if you don't know, the largest credit union in the world. And he basically described that the most like embedded AI deployment that we really heard about was that he is using AI in loan decisioning, in fraud detection, check deposits, customer interactions, and internal workflows. It is like completely across all of their core operations. And so, Kyle, I am kind of interested in your point of view on this, which is that AI is influencing, things that really do affect people, like loan decisions and fraud issues and everything. So the stakes feel really high, I think, both for the companies and for the people that are using the bank. And so what does trust actually mean in a deployment like that? Like when you're working with really sensitive information, when you're kind of in a very high stakes area.
Yeah, I think like pretty much everybody is universally going to demand to be able to see an audit of like the decision-making chain. What was the interaction that happened? What was the situation? What did the model decide to do? What were the data inputs into the model that it used to make the decision? And this is nothing unique, I think, to AI actually. Like this has been true for a long time. If you look at like the requirements that are in place on um, anything that touches like underwriting and some of these like key like especially like consumer facing financial stuff, like there's a lot of requirements that companies have to meet in terms of audit, being able to show evidence trails. There's certain types of data that are not allowed to be factors in like underwriting decisions. It's protected classes of data. You have to be able to demonstrate that that data is not present in the decision process. So I don't know that that's really new for AI. AI is just a different way of making the decisions. But it means that we have to essentially take all of those systems of record, observability and monitoring of like what happened, logging it, being able to provide the evidence if we get audited, that kind of thing. And you basically have to make sure that that is also going to work with an AI based system as opposed to maybe a more you know, traditional machine learning approach. So the task is really the same, and I think the requirements are the same, but the implementation of it changes. And again, if you have a model that's able to make decisions in a series of steps, you need to be able to record all of those different steps and What decisions did the model take at each point in the reasoning chain, that kind of thing. So, um, yeah, again, like anytime you're in one of these types of industries or scenarios where things are highly regulated, like the challenge is pretty extreme in terms of the reporting and the observability. I think that's ultimately what produces the trust is knowing that the company that you're interacting with that might be giving you, something that's related to your credit, for example, knowing that they are subject to those regulations and that they do comply with them and that at any moment they can be, required to produce evidence that things are being done the right way. I think ultimately like that gets you pretty close to trust. And then
Yeah.
it's on the company to, not have any major incidents or to fail an audit. And obviously if they do, then, that results in loss of trust from customers and then they might go somewhere else. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's kind of an observability and audit question.
Yeah. No, I think that that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of does tie back to something. I think it was Miles that said something about how AI doesn't really create the problems, but it will amplify them
Yeah.
by about a million times. So,
Yeah, the problems aren't really that novel,
yeah,
but the
Yeah.
way that you have to address them might change.
Yeah. And the speed with which they're, being uncovered goes
yeah,
faster. If you have a human in the loop, a human can only make a decision and a mistake so quickly. If you
yeah,
have a machine in the loop, it's just gonna keep making the same mistake unless you tell it not to.
yeah. Awesome. So our final use case is commission accuracy. So Saurav Sen is the VP of Enterprise Data and AI Platforms at AmeriLife, which is an insurance company. And he actually describes a use case for commission payouts, basically, which does kind of sound like a back office accounts payable problem until you realize that they have thousands of affiliates, thousands of partners. They're basically paying out millions of commission transactions. And so they are using AI to handle reconciliation across operations, finance. Basically, that all feeds back to their general ledger. And this is really important because if you underpay agents, you're eroding the relationship with those insurance agents. And obviously, if you overpay them, your revenue is going to take a hit.
Human
And
agents, not agents.
yes, important distinction. Human
Yeah.
insurance agents here. But Sarah said something that I think applies really well beyond insurance and really to all of these use cases and every industry right now, which is that once the trust is lost, it's very hard to bring it back. So, Igor, question for you, which is basically these are five different industries, five very different use cases. What is the common thread, and what do all of these teams have to get right, kind of regardless of their industry?
I think it's going back to that first point that we made, which is, governance is an accelerator. It's about knowing what the system's doing. It's about having the right controls in place, having the right visibility into what AI is doing for you, how it's making those decisions. So then you can correct it and accelerate that adoption because then the people using the AI and working with it are going to trust it more. I think another part of that we didn't call out necessarily, but in mo many of these conversations, this was a long-term effort. This isn't a like one-off MVP project that got implemented and we got our 20% gains at BP and we're moving on. This is a large-scale program and effort that takes time and builds upon the successes that it already has. And it's not about having a checklist. It's not about saying, like, great, we got something in production, we can move on. It's about having that continuous visibility and the kinds of platforms and the kinds of processes internally in your organization to support that growth, support that usage, and ensure its trust.
Yeah, awesome.
There's
Um,
a there's
mhm.
a good quote from motorsport about slow is fast and fast is or slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I
Yep.
think that applies very much here. If you go a little too fast and hit some potholes and things get nasty, then that ultimately results in a slow rollout and you're gonna have to backtrack and have a lot of problems. If you slow down a little bit, and kind of do things the right way and invest a little bit in the foundation, then that sets you up for going faster overall.
For sure. So speaking of problems, that is what I want to get into next. Really because across every single one of the sessions that we had during the AI Trust Summit, we did have some great wins. We did have some great people talking about some really awesome use cases, but we also kept hearing very similar problems and challenges that people are running into, regardless of how they're deploying AI. So there are three specific problems that came up really regardless of industry, and I want to talk about them directly because I think also trying to recognize the exact problem that you're running into is sometimes half the battle with, these really big projects. So first problem is really the data problem, which is that confidence doesn't really equal trust in your AI outputs. And the number one thing that we heard is that data quality has really gone from a background concern to kind of an emergency, really, as AI is being deployed. And Eleanor said this in her opening keynote, which is that you can have a model that you're 99% confident in, but if it's sitting on top of an environment, with really zero data certainty on what's underneath, then you're going to have some problems. And there is data to back this up as far as how people are concerned about it. So in the BARC 2024 survey, data quality was in the bottom three concerns. And that was kind of when companies were more in the experimentation phase, right? They were kind of in the pilot stage. They didn't really have things like in production at the same scale that we're seeing now. And then in 2025, as many of those companies got their pilots into production, it jumped to the number one concern for 44% of respondents. And Ibrahim from Marathon in his session explained that if you have bad data, it's going to be multiplied and become a much bigger problem when you start using AI at scale. And Barack from Navy Federal said, the ancient rule is garbage in and garbage out has always been true. AI just makes the consequences immediate. So, Kyle, you kind of made a point at the summit in your session, which is that AI trust kind of sometimes tends to focus on the wrong thing. So, what should companies be looking at? What should they be looking for as they're trying to build this?
Yeah, the point that I had made that I think you're referring to was that a lot of people worry about hallucination, and that's kind of a like what range anxiety is for EVs, hallucination anxiety is for LLMs. Effectively,
Mhm.
that's like the boogeyman that everybody's worried about. But I think in both like what Ibrahim and Barack's cases brought up was that you even if you have a very, very, very low rate of hallucination and like that is something that the foundation model teams are constantly improving and like some of like the newer models, I feel like in for day-to-day use, like it's actually gotten quite good. Um, but it's not the bigger risk is not really the hallucination of the model. It's that the model doesn't know whether the data that it's reading in to form a response, it has no natural way of like assessing whether or not that data is reliable. So like if you look at this from like a consumer standpoint, you go to ChatGPT or Claude, you ask it for advice on, I don't know, you want to buy an air purifier for your house or something. So it's going to go and do a web search. It's going to go find 10 of them, and then it's going to give you, some results. If you don't actually pay any attention to what links it's using to go and read those reviews, what it's essentially doing is summarizing other things that it found online that were written by other people, which might be garbage. In which case, the recommendation for your air purifier might also be garbage. But it sounds nice because it did all this, thoughtful analysis and wrote some very confident text around it. So it's the same problem in the enterprise environment. The model can be very sophisticated, does not hallucinate frequently, really good at pulling together a very compelling analysis of things, but it doesn't have a way of assessing the quality of the inputs it's running on. And so that then becomes the task of the enterprise. And so in those cases, a lot of effort has to go into assessing, is this data AI ready or not? Which is, it's a bit of a buzzword, but then when you hit a production case like that, it becomes like the bottleneck. It's like if we've got all this data in our lake or our warehouse and we're trying to do conversational analytics with it and we open up the aperture so that the model can query whatever it wants, the odds that it's going to hit something that is bad, it's really a matter of time problem. And then that means that you hit that trust issue because somebody's going to get something that's demonstrably wrong, and then it's going to take a long time to earn the trust back. So I think what everybody was bringing up with the garbage in, garbage out question was essentially that like the model might be amazing, but if it's running on bad inputs, you have to have a way of preventing that.
For sure. Awesome. So the second problem that I want to dive into next is basically that all of these companies, we have a lot of controls and practices around data, but they are built for humans.
Mhm.
And this was something that was brought up in the security session. And Joan, our CISO, was actually moderating that conversation with Stephen from Salesforce. And she really talks about how a lot of assumptions are made that our users are people and agents are really totally different. And this isn't like a specific security problem. It is actually ending up to be a fundamental rethink of how access and controls actually need to work in an AI environment. So, Igor, I would love for you to answer this, which is really that because the controls made for humans are going to break down with agents, what does the replacement need to look like? Like, what do we need to put into place to actually control these agents?
That's a really great question. I think the real mindset shift from controlling humans to controlling agents is the fact that with agents, you need to continuously monitor what they're doing and be proactive about changing their behavior and understand and analyzing their behavior and doing something about that. The old model, if you think about even permissions and access control, you have for humans, it's pretty easy to say you are part of this team and therefore you should have access to this particular folder or this particular email or this particular, set of um, internal access to documents. However, with agents, the promise of agents is that agents are going to coalesce data from all of these multiple different sources and come up with a great answer based on all of the information that they have. But that implicitly means that the agent needs to have permissions and access to all of these sources, which sometimes now falls down to what should the user of that agent be seeing, not necessarily what should the agent be accessing. And that's where it gets tricky because we're adding another layer of abstraction there, which says today the user has permissions, but now you have the user needs to have permissions to pass through those permissions and make sure the agent can respect that. And that's something that's tricky, and that's something that requires a lot of thought, but also that leads to a lot of, you know, now a whole new greenfield problem of I need to make sure that nobody's doing anything bad. Before audits and logging are all still around, and you can understand what are people doing and are people doing something malicious. That's still around. But now it's about doing that at scale, at the scale of agents. And so proactively understanding what's the agent doing, staying on top of that, making sure that the people who should or should not be seeing information are well within the bounds, and if not, flagging that early and then adapting your processes, changing the permissions on the agent, changing your access control, maybe even to the chat interface at that point. And so it's not a one-time setup and then, once every 6-month audit. It's a continuous process that needs to keep happening with agents. And that I think is the big mindset shift is rather than a rare one-off major event, it's a continuous, slow potential for problems.
Yeah. So the third problem that I want to dive into kind of hits hardest when we talk about really regulated industries. But I think it's kind of coming for everyone, which is that when AI makes a decision and someone asks why, are you actually able to answer this? And Brock kind of brought this up in his session. And he said AI trust has to mean certainty, certainty that we can explain a decision, trace it back to the data, and stand behind the outcome when there is a real financial and regulatory impact. And besides those, there is also a real person on the other end of your AI outcomes of these decisions. And when that person asks why the AI did what it did, the answer kind of needs to exist somewhere. So, Kyle, I'll go to you first. And my question for you is if someone like a board member or a regulator asks, like, how can I trust what your AI is doing? What does a good answer actually look like for these enterprises?
Yeah, I think most people at this point are at the understanding that these are not deterministic systems and that they are going to make poor decisions at one point or another. Like that's part of operating. Kind of like, going back to, the NOV example with Shell, it's like their goal is just reduce the amount of downtime that they have on their equipment. It's never to get it to zero. That's not really an achievable goal. So I think hopefully, anybody who's deploying AI at this point is already kind of thinking in that mindset, which is that things are going to go wrong. It's
Yeah.
then the question of what controls do you have in place? What auditability do you have? What logging did you have? And, were you able to mitigate the damage when the situation did come up? Were you able to make things right for the customer who happened to be affected by it? Um, and you need to be able to demonstrate to the board member of the regulator that you are aware when the bad outcome occurs. You need to have some way of detecting that happened. You need to be able to show kind of the chain of custody from where the data originated to how it got used by the model. What specific data was touched? What was the state of it at the time? Do we know where it came from? Was the model supposed to be using that data? You need to be able to show kind of the trace from the model itself. What, steps did it go through? What reasoning did it do? And all this stuff needs to be sort of obviously automatically logged and recorded, and it needs to be accessible when you need to pull a report on an incident that did happen. So I think being able to detect the incident is important, and then having all that evidence kind of at hand of like what was the state of the entire system that resulted in that outcome. And then the last bit is like, what's the mitigation strategy, and are you able to sort of like make things right for whoever was affected? And again, like that should not be an afterthought. That needs to be part of the plan from the get-go. If I order something from Amazon and it arrives damaged, it's like, of course, Amazon knows what to do in that situation. They have a process in place. If it's above a certain dollar amount, we're going to do this. If it's below a dollar amount, we're going to do that. If the customer has a history with us, we're going to treat it this way, whatever. But like that's all predetermined, and they're prepared for that situation. And I think being able to demonstrate that set of controls and processes that they exist, you have a plan, you know what you're going to do, and that you have the ability to introspect the whole system. I think that's really the trick here.
So I
And
think a lot of, oh, sorry, Igor.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think there's two sides to every action. There's the carrot and the stick. You're afraid of something going wrong, or you want something to be better. And so I think those controls, all of that visibility is very important to know when things are going wrong and make sure that they do not. However, there's also the flip side to this, which is what Miles brought up in his session, which is how do you get users to adopt this faster?
Mhm.
How do I incentivize my team to use AI? And that's the carrot side of the trust coin, which is if I have used this AI and gives me a good answer that is interesting and correct and valid, and I make a good decision off of that, I am much more likely to keep using AI. And so for that, it really is those same sets of controls, but presented perhaps in a different way. Presented in the way that says, look, we've already done all the trust checks on this, and we know that this response is, accurate maybe up to last week because we don't have data for this week, and you should be aware of that before you make any decisions. It's kind of like Kyle's package. Like if Amazon put a little seal of like, we definitely know this thing is not broken because we tested it before we shipped it to you. That is kind of the flip side of it. Take those same information that you have and all that context that you have about what AI is accessing, and then surface that back up to the user.
I um I bought a part for my car recently, and it actually interestingly came with a little printout of the stress test that they did on the part, which was kind of neat. And it was like it's not just sort of a generic quality control check. It was literally like these are the test results from the test we ran on your part, and it like had the person's name on it who like ran the results and it passed. I don't really see that very often, but like it was pretty neat
Yeah.
to know that was like, okay, this part, they know that it like does not fail at loads up to a certain,
Mhm.
amount. And that was neat. But that's, I think, to your point, Igor, like finding a way to present that evidence essentially
Right.
to your users, it gives them the trust that the thing is going to work when they actually try to use it.
Right. And they're showing that system of how they're delivering that printout to their auditors, but then you're getting the output of it and you're feeling better about what
Yeah,
you purchased.
it's not just for the auditors, it's for
Right.
the end user too.
Exactly.
For sure. Awesome. So I want to kind of get to the next last point that we're going to go through because these problems that we just talked through are very real and they're widespread. A lot of people are trying to solve them right now. But our speakers also gave some really amazing advice, really repeatable things that are going to be genuinely actionable for people. So
Mhm.
I want to kind of get into the first piece of advice, which is something that Miles brought up in his session with you, Igor, which is really having a bare minimum starting point for any team trying to get AI into production at scale.
Mhm.
And he said you need to have systems and processes monitored, you need to have data observability, and you need to have governance. If you can get those three things in place at bare minimum, then you're in a really great place. And Ibrahim from Marathon also talked through this four-question framework that he uses before scaling any use case. And he calls them go or no-go questions. And the questions are, one, does the business trust the data? Two, do we have transparency and accountability for outputs? Three, do we have control from value to risk? And four, can we capture and reuse this knowledge? And the principle underneath all of that is that really we need to start looking into ways of how we can design for quality rather than just check for quality.
Yeah.
So, Igor, I'd love for you to get into this, which is where do teams need to start to kind of get an MVP, get a minimum viable product
Yeah.
or process even for rolling these things out?
Yeah, going back to my previous point, designing for quality is that proactive step. It's getting ahead of the problem. It's knowing that the problem will be there and putting the systems in place that you need to do it. I think what I see with a lot of teams is that more reactive check for quality piece where they say, "Oh, well, I know that this has happened to me in the past, therefore I'm going to put in this check." Um, when I worked at Uber, my whole team was responsible for a help desk where people would come in and say, I'm trying to run this report, but the results I'm getting are wrong. We find out why they're wrong, and we're like, oh, well, we aren't actually looking at this pipeline. That's new. Let me go put some, checks on them. That was a very reactive way of saying, well, we've seen this problem before, therefore I want to make sure I don't see it again. But what really Miles and Ibrahim are talking about is getting ahead of it. What problems could I see? How do I think about that, and how do I build a strategy around that? And that actually boils down to primarily your data strategy at that point. How are you managing your data? How do you know that it's high quality? What expectations do you have about it? And then layering in that AI strategy on top of that to say, what should AI use? What kind of data is valid for it? And I think a lot of teams now, with the promise of AI, are doing it a little bit backwards, where they're deploying AI first and they're saying, oh my God, AI is going to revolutionize my business. And then they're realizing that a lot of the data that AI decides to access, as I mentioned before, it can access whatever you give it permissions to, is not fit for what they wanted to be used for. And so AI doesn't really create the problem. It really just exposes it at a scale and at a speed that we just haven't seen before. So I think these frameworks that they've laid out are very logical. They make a lot of sense and definitely would encourage people to think proactively about what might go wrong and account for that through processes and through platforms.
So I actually want to kind of come back to this whole idea of governance as an accelerator, which you've kind of already mentioned, Igor. This, I think, was one of the biggest talking points of the whole day. It came up in a whole bunch of sessions. And Ibrahim, it was a big theme in his session specifically. And he said governance is an accelerator. It's not setting on the brake. The winners in the AI era will not be the people who have the most pilots and the most use cases, but the people who have the strongest operating discipline. And Miles kind of echoes that when he said, focus on governance first, make it an enabler and not a gate that you have to get through.
Mhm.
And I don't think that this is just kind of advice for governance, but I think this idea that, governance will slow us down is really across departments. People also think the same of, oh, security is going to slow us down. Oh, legal is going to slow us down. And obviously, each one of these departments are going to kind of have their own standards, their own things that they need in order to make sure that, these AI projects roll out safely. Um, but Kyle, this question is for you, which is really, how do you change that? How do you stop kind of experiencing like security, legal, governance, all of these things as, breaks? And how do you kind of use them to accelerate these rollouts?
I think the framing is important, and that's something that we heard, on the call, or on the different calls. But you have to make sure that you're also communicating that framing internally to those various teams as well. Like it's
Mhm.
one thing to, give a talk at a summit and say that governance is an accelerator, but you really have to be beating that drum internally as well, because that's not, I think, the default view that most people have of it. Everybody's had to deal with some really um, annoying process, at one point or another in their professional lives. And so when you see something like the word governance, immediately you're kind of like, oh, okay, this is going to be gnarly. It's going to slow everything down. Everything's going to be difficult. And it doesn't have to be that way. But the person who's championing the program, I think, really has to be branding it internally as an accelerative effort and not as a bunch of hurdles that everybody's going to have to go through. I think the one of the key components in that is that it really cannot be process for process's sake, and that's a very easy trap for a lot of people to fall into. So the goal needs to be a clearly articulated set of bad outcomes that the governance is going to prevent.
Mhm.
Like, this is a bad thing that could happen. The governance will help us make sure the bad thing does not happen. Here's a different type of bad thing that could happen. It is going to help us make sure that that does not happen either. And it needs to, I think, be really repetitively oriented towards preventing those things that would tank the AI program, rather than, hey, we have to do this process because this is the process we have to do. Nobody wants to do that, right? And then that's just getting in the way. So I think the branding and the internal, beating of the drum of it in that scope is important. And then the follow through on that is it actually has to be just the steps that are actually necessary for preventing the negative outcome and not more than that. So I think preventing complexity in the governance process, again, something that the person who's coordinating the whole effort is going to have to do carefully, because if you have a whole bunch of different stakeholders and everybody brings all of the various things that they want to the table and you just take all of that and merge it all into one big governance process, it is probably going to turn out to be a nightmare. So that
Mm.
person, I think, is going to have to exercise judgment about saying, how do we keep the governance process as slim as we can, such that it still provides the protections that we need to go fast, um, but not more than that for no specific gain. And I think maybe an example some folks can relate to on this is like if you've ever tried to like sign up for like a 5K or something and you've never run before, it's really easy to drown yourself in like, well, what type of shoe should I be buying? And like, how short should my shorts be? And do I need a special type of shirt that is air wicking? And I need, sunglasses with full face coverage. And
Yeah.
well, where am I going to run my practice route? And it's like you haven't even left your laptop at that point. Like, so you can
Yeah.
just drown yourself in the complexity of preparing for the thing when the thing that actually matters is the consistency at which you're getting out and doing the practice run. That's the thing that actually builds up the fundamentals. And I think the same thing is true here. If you want to drown yourself in governance complexity, you certainly can do that, and it will go poorly. So I think the trick is the framing, the repetition, but then also keeping it as simple as you can while it's still providing the controls that you need.
Mhm.
Awesome. So just avoiding that decision fatigue sounds like that's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so last one. And I wanted to kind of save this for the end because I know a lot of organizations are trying to get a handle on this right now. And Barack from Navy Federal really was talking about how getting internal people to use AI is not really just about them using the tool, but it's also getting them to use it in the right way. So he said that the goal here is not just adoption, but it's calibration. And Miles also talked about this a bit, and he had specific advice on actually sequencing your rollouts to employees. And he said that statistically, about 10% of any organization are these early adopter types. So he gave the advice of start there, let them see productivity gains, and it'll kind of grow by itself. And he did add a warning, which he did say that once you've kind of unleashed that 10%, it is important to be prepared for that
Mhm.
grassroots adoption because it may happen a lot more rapidly than you're anticipating. But I think a lot of companies are still kind of stuck even before the 10%. You know, they are struggling. They're putting out these pilots. They are kind of struggling to get people to use them in the first place. And so, Igor, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your opinion and also what speakers have said about like how do you get internal users excited about your projects and also maybe how do you manage the chaos that comes with all of these changes?
Yeah, the Miles, I think perhaps in the session alluded to it, but I've definitely talked to plenty of folks around having a internal champion. Effectively, you're creating a new project that has a lot of risk. You're changing how people are working day to day, and having an internal champion that says, "Hey, I used AI to solve my problem, and now this is not a problem for me." And presenting that back to their team gets you a very, very long way. And we do that at Bigeye as well. We talk about, hey, here's the problem I'm solving with AI, and here's how I'm solving it. And someone says, oh, I also have that problem. Great, tell me how you did this because I want to take that and then build on it. And that's how
Mhm.
you get a lot of that internal adoption.
Yeah.
I think the thing that you have to be prepared for, again, going back to that productivity, is like once that starts building, there is that like critical mass point where
Mhm.
the acceleration of that adoption is going to go much faster than you expect. And all of a sudden you're going from, 1 to 2 AI tools to 20. And Miles talked about AI sprawl, I remember as well. It's about that being ready for that. It's about being ready to say, yes, let's get some adoption going. Let's find those champions. Let's get some concrete use cases. I think every single talk we had a concrete use case. They were solving for a very specific problem and not the world.
Mhm.
And let's find that problem. Let's find the person who has that problem and make them very happy. Then they're going to go internally and say, hey, I'm very happy with AI. You can be happy too.
Yeah.
But once that noise reaches a certain level, then you better be ready. You better know where AI is being used, how it's being used, and have all that governance in place. And so setting that up early in tandem with your champions and understanding how they're using it gets you to that ability to scale effectively once that um, internal excitement gets built.
I actually love that you brought that up because I think I was like a little hesitant to adopt AI
Hmm.
myself, just as an employee. Like I'm worried about, what if it's wrong and then I'm publishing something that people are going to look at and be like, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
And it was really like doing the hackathons that we've hosted at Big Eye and seeing what other people are doing that then got me like messaging coworkers and being like,
Yeah.
whoa, hey, how did you do that? Like, how are you getting it to work like this for you?
Hmm.
Which like wasn't something that originally I was like totally understanding how to do on my own. So,
Hmm.
I definitely feel like from an employee perspective, that has made a huge difference in
Yeah.
like how I'm willing to experiment and the different
Mhm.
kinds of projects that I've been
Yeah.
trying just on my
And
own.
and now you're gonna pass it on too, and that's how it
There you
builds. It's
go.
exponential from there. Yeah.
For sure. All right, so let's close this out because we're kind of getting to the end of this hour. But I would like to just kind of leave everyone with one piece of advice, which is basically given everything that we've talked about today, everything that we talked about at the AI Summit, if someone is watching this right now, is kind of feeling stuck and is wondering, okay, where do I start? Just like in the next few days, in the next couple of weeks. What is the one thing that you'd tell them to work on in the next 30 days? We'll go to Kyle first and then Igor.
Mhm.
Well, my answer is maybe a little bit indirect here, but one of I remember one of the, at the end of the panel session that I was on, one of the questions was everything's changing very rapidly, right? So
Hmm.
things are new. We're getting new news, every couple of weeks or something. There's something pretty interesting getting announced. So I think a lot of folks struggle with that. It's easy to feel overwhelmed that like it's changing so rapidly. Like, how do I keep up? So one of the questions was like, what is still constantly in flux, and are there any elements of the picture that are looking somewhat stable that can be invested in without worrying that, your work is going to be throwaway in a month? And my answer on that was the data layer, and investments in the way that you operate your data layer are going to pay off regardless of what's going on in the AI layer. So if you make your data warehouse, if you improve your data modeling a little bit, if you improve your data quality controls a little bit, if you identify sensitive data in some places that you didn't know about it previously, those are all things that are going to pay dividends regardless of what's happening, in terms of how you're applying AI or what the adoption looks like yet with your employees internally, et cetera. Like it's kind of it's a no regret move. So investments in the data platform, I think, are a good place to start just because it cuts through some of that noise. And you know that you're going to get a benefit from it, however you apply AI, as long as it's touching your enterprise data. And I think that's 99% of use cases anyway. So for somebody who's trying to get started, I think that's like a very easy thing to recommend because the odds that it's not going to pay off
Yeah.
basically zero.
Igor, what about you?
I I still think that the most important thing is to understand and get proactive about it. I bet that even if you are watching this and you're saying, well, I don't have, 20 different instances of various AI agents doing things at my company, you're probably wrong. And your team is probably already doing something with AI because, people naturally find the path of least resistance to get their job done. And I think the most important part there is understanding where that is. Who is using AI, how are they using it, both from a to share that back out with the team, as we just talked about, but also to understand, well, now that we know what these patterns are, we can build the processes, we can build these frameworks around them. That way you can then get ahead of that before, the rest of the company starts adopting it. As long as AI has been around, we're still in fairly early stages of meaningful adoption within, especially within large enterprises.
Yeah.
And just because you don't have those controls in place right now doesn't mean you can't get them in time. The wave is still building. We're not cresting yet, and doing it now is better than waiting. It's not too late to get ahead of it.
Great. So we are going to wrap up. Thank you guys so much for joining. I really just want to end with there is one session or one thread that I think really ran through all of the sessions at the summit, which is really that at the end of the day, the companies that are able to move fastest when it comes to AI aren't the ones with a lot of pilots necessarily, but they're the ones who have already built the foundation for AI. And I would like to just leave everyone with this quote, which is that the data work isn't the precursor to the AI work, it is the AI work, which I think is just really the best advice of this moment. Um, but yeah, thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you to everyone who was watching. If you are interested in seeing some of the sessions from the AI Summit, if you weren't able to make it, or if you were only able to make it to certain sessions, it is on our website, and you guys will get an email with all of that info as well as a replay of today. Feel free to reach out to me, Igor, or Kyle with any questions. We didn't really have a lot of time for Q&A today, but we do appreciate everyone that was able to attend, and we'll see you guys next time.